Hello and welcome to What the Tech from Boast AI, where we talk with some of the brilliant minds behind new and exciting tech initiatives to learn what it takes to tackle technological uncertainty and eventually change the world. Today, I am thrilled to welcome VentureX Principal Sydney Wong onto the show. Exited tech founder turned early stage investor with 10 plus years of experience in venture capital, startups, and management consulting. She currently leads investments at VentureX Capital and built their venture studio from the ground up as a first hire. Her expertise spans deal sourcing, due diligence, and portfolio support with a track record in pre-seed to Series A. On top of all that, Sydney is passionate about building high-impact startups and fostering a strong VC community as a chapter lead for the Women in VC. It's an incredible mission, and I'm excited to pick her brain on her experience to date in the startup space, what's on deck for the rest of 2024, and her take on the tech and startup ecosystem heading into 2025. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Sydney.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul.
Well, I'm so happy to have you here. I mean, you are very long overdue because I know we first crossed paths and I think met on the show circuit last year. I believe either in Toronto or Montreal. I think it was at Collision in Toronto, maybe?
I think it was in Collision. I think it was in Toronto, but I don't know if it was Collision or a different conference.
Needless to say, we're both very busy people. And Sydney, I'd love to hear. I gave a rundown of your CV and a little bit of your past experience. Tell me about how you got into the tech space, the startup space, and how you got to VentureX today.
Yeah. So my story started on a whim. I did my 5 years in corporate, and after my MBA, a friend of mine said that if I was very serious into learning more about tech and startup, I needed to move down to Silicon Valley. So I bought a one-way ticket and I moved in with him. I stayed there because I realized I cannot get an apartment anywhere because I don't have a credit report. I didn't know that they did not take Canadian credit reports. I knew that now. And so I stayed there and I learned a lot about tech, about startup, and about investors. And I was like, for the rest of my life, this is where I want to be. I want to be in a place where people are solutions oriented and like-minded, and they are there to not only be aware of problems, but also be there to solve them. And it was just such a fascinating and interesting world. So that is actually where I created my first startup, VentureX. And so it was in the fintech space, came back to Canada to actually build it out. And I worked with a lot of different accelerators, incubators, and investors across Canada. Then I was at Startup Canada's Women Entrepreneur of the Year finalist. And then I went to Hong Kong and China for several months thinking about expanding there. And yeah, I actually was speaking at Hong Kong FinTech Week, which is why I originally went there. But then I stayed for a bit to visit family and things like that. And that's where I met the Family Office Fund, which is where I eventually exited to. So the Korean Family Office out in Victoria, BC, which is my hometown. And so I met them I think I met them on Christmas Eve. And I was introduced by one of the mentors, a futurepreneur, with this is something that you should go and do while you're here for the week that you're here. I'm like, all right, that sounds great. And so they actually bought out my product and internalized it and use it kind of internally in the Family Office Fund. So it's not public anymore. They really like the name of the company. So they actually wanted to keep the name, reincorporate it under the Family Office Fund, which is why it's called VentureX Capital. And so we invest in early stage companies, pre-seed all the way through to Series A, software-based, industry agnostic, just cannot invest in things that are a little bit too capital heavy. There is a valuation cap even for the tech startups, and you have to have a lead and you have to have some kind of traction or MRR in order to pitch. And so, yeah, it's very interesting to work in a family office fund. And then since then, I've also worked at 2 other funds as well, including a venture studio fund for clean and climate tech. So that was my experience in hardware. And then also at another family office fund in Montreal.
Oh my God. Sydney, that is an impressive resume. And I'm glad that you jumped in to add some more context here because you are doing so much and have so much in your back pocket in terms of experience across industries and even just across different kinds of businesses too. One thing I want to call back on that I think will be the first lesson for our listeners, they do not accept Canadian credit reports in Silicon Valley or in the United States. I didn't know that. So just anyone in the room who's looking to book a one-way ticket, don't make the mistake Sydney made, unless you have a friend with a couch that you can crash on. Because it ain't cheap to be out in the Valley. I know that. And I'm here in Boston where it's not much better. But that's just one really cool piece of the puzzle that I didn't know before we started this conversation. I also didn't know, too, that you've been involved in both software and hardware, lots of family offices. Could you tell me a little bit about where your focus is today? I know you had mentioned that some of the businesses that you're specifically helping right now, it's industry agnostic, but it's primarily software.
Okay.
Tell me a little bit about what those businesses look like today and If you're comfortable maybe naming a few, if I know that it's hard to pick a favorite, but if there's one that's doing some really cool stuff and you want to give them a shout out, this is the perfect venue.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I really like that the businesses that I like in my personal investment thesis. I want to see if a business can be transferred into 100 different countries and 100 different languages. A lot of people build things in a vacuum, right? And they're like, this is going to be tech, but for this, or like, this is an automated system to replace the job that I used to have for 18 months. And that's fine, but it may not translate across borders. And so the interesting thing about being the kind of investor where a lot of my schedule is going back and forth from Canada and US every few weeks on this of the border, and is that you are seeing a lot of different things, but depending on the world of the founder, they would see things differently. So it's kind of like that to say the world isn't the way that it is, it's the way that we are. So I've literally seen one couple build an entire company that solved the problem for just them. And I'm like, but there's no one else that would use this. And they're like, will you help us raise money? And like, I don't even know where to start with this. I can't even understand like why. So yeah, like, those are the kinds of things that I find to be particularly interesting. I know that Canada is really big on manufacturing, on building things, as well as just being able to enable older industries, whether it be mining, whether it be inventory and those kinds of things. So Brew Ninja is one of our portfolio companies. And so they're out in Saskatchewan, huge tech hub. And they are inventory system and CRM kind of like combined. And it's really interesting. They're starting off in the brewery and distillery space, and then they're moving on into food and things like that. So what I have found that is an interesting challenge when it comes to Canadian startups is like how they're really crossing borders and what kind of things that they really need, because R&D is great here. And then how do you get to that commercialization? And then after that, how do you get through that scaling? And so these are the kinds of things that I think all investors are working on with their portfolio companies, especially in a market where you're not raising as quickly or as often as you used to in previous years.
Absolutely. I think you're bringing a really unique perspective here compared to some of the recent conversations we had. I want to call back to that example, maybe a cautionary tale about that couple who just created a solution that solved an acute problem for them. Yeah. You had said it earlier. Can it translate across borders? That's table stakes. There is not as much funding rounds that's going on right now, and you really need to make something that's going to translate to a wider audience. We say all the time on the show, start with a problem you feel, and try to find the solution from that. But again, if there's no market for it, how dare you go asking for funding? I mean, you've got to be your own angel at that point. So I think that's something founders who listen to our show need to be sure that they're striking here. Think about the problem you're solving. Make sure it's a real problem. Make sure it's a acute problem. But make sure it's not just your problem. Make sure that there is a market. And also that's part of the whole research and development too. Like you need to get that customer vetted. You need to get that customer buy-in. And again, maybe that's where you start getting the funding before you solve the problem for yourself and then go ask for investors. Go talk to other people who can solve that problem. But all that to say is I love that we're hearing from the point of view of one of those investors what they're going to be looking for. I think it's more important than ever today too. And I love the example of Brew Ninja, not just because I love me a beer garden and I love me a distillery. So would love to hear more about that at a different date. Could you tell me a little bit more about some of the other programs that you partner with too? I know, again, we mentioned at the top here, we met at an event. You're always flying all over the place to try to meet up with new founders. What are some of the business accelerators, incubators, or even just events that are maybe your favorites? Canada, in the US, wherever.
Yeah, I really love my participation in the Women in Venture Capital. I feel like so there are several of these sectors, right? Yeah. So I create quarterly events in person for people here in Montreal. I fly back and forth to do that. Sometimes I'm in New York and then I come back for like 3 days in Montreal just to host an event. And then I take an 11-hour train back to New York. And yeah. And then I go and I do New York Tech Week because it's like 750 events. They all are they have help from A16Z, which is incredible. All the side events are free to go to, and they're heavily sponsored by everyone and their mothers. Literally like every single bank, every single different kinds of accelerators open their doors. It's kind of like an invitation in order for you as a new startup or as investors to go and to see what other people are doing and what they're about and find ways to collaborate. So yeah, so it's been incredible this past year. We are having a new upcoming event in November in partnership with the CVCA for Women in Venture Capital. So that's really exciting to get to partner with them. And I know that they're doing really great work out in Ontario and across the nation for different new venture capitalists that are coming into the market. So these are the ones that come off the top of my head. And they were like really big highlights for 2024 for me, both in US as well as in Canada. And I look forward to participating in more of them. I will actually be speaking at the Future of AI conference in San Francisco in January. So looking forward to that. I can't tell you what it's about yet because I haven't gone, but I'm sure that it's going to be a really amazing event.
Oh, that's so exciting. And also, it's a really exciting topic too, because who knows where we'll be in January in terms of what the hot topic around AI would be. So mark your calendars, listeners, if you're going to be going to that event, but also stay tuned, watch Sydney, because the perspective and the actual topic, it could be something that's wildly different just based on how quickly everything's been evolving in that sphere. And just like 3 months ago. Oh, wow. And to that point about travel and how you're all over the place in a good way, you're checking all your boxes, making sure that you're in all the hot markets. I do want to shout out that Startup Weeks and all the free things that come around those. Startup Weeks, Tech Weeks, you mentioned New York Tech Week. I actually feel like I've overburdened my calendar for next week. We're recording this in early September, flying out to San Francisco for SaaStr. It's Boston Startup Week, actually, and I'm kicking myself because I'm going to be missing it. But you raised a good point about the free events. And I think the founders in our audience, bear that in mind. A lot of these things you're going to see buy a ticket or register to go to this thing where it's going to be drinks and food, but you got to pay a price to get through. There's so much free that happens on the side of these events that I think people can really take advantage of. And you're going to meet some great people and you're going to have fun. That's the other thing too. You have a vested interest in making sure they can make some organic noise around this. So go be that cheerleader on the ground if you can at any of these shows. You'll meet people like Sydney and you'll catch them as speakers too when you go to these things. Yeah. So we talked a lot about the event calendar now. I'd love to know in 2025, outside of kind of the event circuit, what are some of your priorities for both VentureX, but also just personally in terms of where you are at as an investor? What would you like to see happen over the next year?
Yeah. So I have my own podcast that I'm working on. So it's a VC podcast. Your colleague from Boast, Miriam, has been on it. She rocked it. It was amazing. I still have a lot more amazing and exciting guests that are coming on. So that's really exciting for me. So that's really great for 2024. I'm still traveling back and forth a lot. I signed up to work with a all female founder fund in New York City. So this is a side gig that I have, which I'm really excited about. And so in Fund One, they have 60 portfolio companies. So they needed my help to help them go from pre-seed through to Series A in terms of scalability and just helping them with a lot of these business strategies that they're working on. So that's exciting because they're also across all different industries. I think they've invested in companies from 3 different countries. Ooh. I've also was a mentor and volunteer at the 43 North, which is an accelerator in Buffalo, New York. So very close to both you and I. And and so I was one of the investor judges for their $1 million pitch. And so that was really exciting to get to see who's going to make it, and who's going to go through the accelerator and what they're going to do with that $1 million, how they're going to grow. So I'm always rooting for the startups that are doing all the right things, and just really excited to be able to see these kinds of things happen and be able to support really great founders.
That is music to my ears, Sydney, and it's so, so cool. I do want to pull back to the point you made earlier about your podcast, Unlocking Venture Capital podcast, folks. Like we said, this is a little bit of a different flavor than the normal guests that we have on the show because we do talk to a lot of founders. You bring a very unique perspective, and I think that perspective on your show week to week, every time that you have a guest on, is something that our founder community really needs to tap into. Not that they're not doing a great job building their products and realizing their vision and achieving scale, but knowing what they're looking for on the other side of the coin when you're going out there, I think is so cool. And I'm so glad that you've made this resource available to everybody. So listeners, subscribe, Unlocking Venture Capital podcast. I know I follow you guys on LinkedIn too, so that's another way to follow along with what's going on. What is some sage wisdom or maybe even just advice you would give to any entrepreneurs who are looking to get going over the next year, whether in 2025, maybe they're riding it out to wait and see how the election pans out here in the States, or any other reason they might have sat on the sidelines, but how can somebody get started in 2025 on the best foot?
Yeah, I was on a TwitterX event with an investor panel, and this really great question came on. And I was like, this was really smart. So a founder asked, how much traction you need to be qualified for investment. And I was like, yeah, this makes sense because it's true. Today's world, it is the easiest time in the whole world to build a tech startup. It is also the most competitive for that exact same reason, right? So when I built my startup, there was no AI just because the tech was not at the same level at that time. And so it would be laughable if that's what I was going to build, And so what I would say is that the more traction that you can get, the more you have on your side in terms of risk assessment, right? Because all VCs and investors will be looking to see, well, what are the levels of risk that I would be taking if I come in at this level? Are they able to monetize, or will all the users be leaving if they try? And are they finding the right markets, or are they still testing it out? So kind of how much you're doing in your business and what you're focused on in your business and the market is super key right now, because you should never be building a business for your investors. You should be building it for your market. Your market will never lie to you.
Absolutely. Build it for your market. It ties back to that point we made earlier about how understanding who you're selling to and who your customers are going to be is table stakes. It's part and parcel with doing the R&D that you need to do to build your MVP. But do you think that point around traction, though, is a great one as well? Even talking about the investors, though, I remember we were talking to Lauren from SaaScan a few months back, and she was just talking about what the runway is. The bare minimum now is the 12 to 24 months runway. It used to be more abbreviated than that. You used to be able to get away with 8 months. You used to be able to get away with 6 months in some scenarios. And there's just a lot more uncertainty. So as much traction as possible, I think, is more or less the best answer here. Do everything you can. Tap into every resource you have. I got to give Shred the shout out here because, again, that is non-dilutive funding. That is free capital for you to take advantage of to extend your runway and meet that 12 to 24 month goal if you're doing something that's truly unique and innovative. And like you said today, there is no better time to get started because we have all these tools. We have AI. We have all these assets in our corner to build cool tech. Make that differentiator by focusing on R&D. That's how you can get your competitive advantage. Make sure that you're building something cool. Meet those Shred qualification standards. I'll put the white paper that explains what those are into the show notes here so everybody can download them. But that is one way to really set yourself apart. Identify market white space. Be a powerful competitor. So I love that advice. I think it is fantastic advice. And Sydney, I cannot thank you enough for sharing all of this with us. I'm going to do a soft outro at that point, but was there anything else we wanted to bring up before I get to the wrap up?
No, I think we're good.
Well, Sydney, I cannot thank you enough. This is an absolute pleasure. Like I said, it's overdue.